What I'm going to be talking about is, as Bart said, I'm going to be talking about upper middle income countries, which I know is an increasingly critical issue for the ADB. And over the last few years, you've really begun to sharpen the focus on why those countries are different, what needs to be done to keep growth going, and then what the ADB can do. So there's been a lot of good thinking about that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start off with a definitional point, and then I'll start pretty traditionally. Then I'm going to go into what I would see as a critical dimension that's generally left out, and that's politics and stability. Politics and stability, and the way that fits in with the technical side in driving the transition. I know that for many of you, you would say, well, the ADB doesn't do politics. So thank you very much, and it's time to go. So I'll promise two things. First of all, I will say nothing that would indicate that the ADB should become any more political than it is now. You've got it, in my view, just about right. But then that's caveated with the things I say. The second thing is we'll get to the very end where I'll talk a little bit about some of the things that you might do to become more aware of that political dimension and to find ways to be helpful on that front without ever getting political. Because I know that's a critical issue, those two promises. Okay, the session's quick. I'm just going to talk about these three things, definitions and context, why the Asia Foundation calls these advanced middle income countries instead of upper middle income countries, and why that matters. Core challenges, and that I'm going to go through briefly because that's the part that you will have read if you've read basic documents, and you've been thinking about these things for a while. And then the underlying challenge is what I want to focus on, that political instability dimension, summed up in the idea of political management. How do you manage the process? And then we'll get to the addressing some of the challenges. Okay, quickly on definitions. You've got that top row up there is the standard way of thinking about dividing up categories of countries. It's the World Bank's approach. The ADB follows that. It's made a lot of sense. For us in the Asia Foundation, the bottom end of that looks about right, but the shift from LMICs to UMICs is about right for reasons we'll get into, because there's a change in the nature of growth, and that's part of what you've been focusing on in the work over the last few years. That difference, how upper middle income countries are really different. The problem is the top end, and there's a lot of thinking about categories. We've been talking to the World Bank about it. I know you all have been thinking about it. For us, the problem is between that 12,000, you call these high income, but between that 12,500 or so and 20,000, there are a lot of countries that stall. They're still running into middle income traps and stalling after they've reached high income. That high end is about where Taiwan, Portugal, Greece, these countries are. So it's approximate. Both ends are approximate, but that's why we refer to it as advanced middle income countries. Okay, in this talk, I'm not going to really focus on China because China is of such a scale. It's obviously an upper middle income country, an AMIC, but the scale and seen from many different dimensions. It's really different. I'm not talking about high dependency on natural resource exports. So I'm not really talking about Central Asia very much. Mongolia would be a questionable case, obviously dependent on copper and gold and others. And then small island states are really a different story, and you all think about them in a different way. So I'm primarily focusing on countries dependent on export-oriented industrialization, focusing on manufacturing exports and services. Okay, just to quickly run, so just to show this, I don't want to go down through this in any detail, but it is interesting when you put this on a board like this, and you see the vast scale of the jump here. That can be important. These are the advanced middle-income countries now, again, from 4 to 20. And I stuck in Brazil and Turkey and Chile just to give it a larger context. You got a cluster at the bottom at the early stages, and then you have Malaysia way out ahead. One more doubling in Malaysia will be at 20,000. But at their current growth rate, that's going to take at least a decade, probably longer. Okay. The LMIC, near AMICs are important because those are the countries that within, again, outside of East Asia, those are the Asian countries that within, outside of Central Asia, those are the countries that within somewhere between 2 and 7 or 8 years will be in this category of advanced middle income countries. Okay, what makes these countries different? I won't go over much of this. So these are all the things that you pretty much know. There's poverty is reduced, social indicators are strong. You got a large middle class, and you got high inequality. Inequality may not be growing, but it's there, and it is politicized, which I'll get to in a second. Economies are more advanced. They're more urbanized, more educated, greater in-country capacity to address their own problems. All things that have shown up in these ADB documents, ADB reports and documents. Greater national confidence, more skeptical of donor prescriptions. They can do it themselves, and they increasingly don't want outsiders making prescriptions not on their terms. And that has changed the game. And then a greater ability and a willingness to engage with and shape the regional and global architecture. So they're getting more involved at that level. Okay, core challenge. By definition, going from 4 to 20, the core challenge is growth. So how do you sustain growth? Well, the obvious point is that in the earlier stage, and for the most part in lower middle income countries, it's capital accumulation, expanding the workforce, working, it's cheap labor is the comparative advantage, working low technology. And you can do that up until the point at which you've basically soaked up the available labor. At that point, costs start rising, and you can't compete with the lower costs. You can't compete with the Thailand can't compete with Bangladesh and Vietnam, but it has a hard time moving into a high productivity, innovation-based economy. That requires, and the term I'll use is economic upgrading, and that covers a lot of things. The breadth, the scale, the technical complexity involved in the reform agenda is staggering. If you don't handle that well and you get the growth slowdowns, that's the middle income trap. Basically a low growth equilibrium out of which it's hard to get out of. Now the ADB there's been increasingly good research on these topics, a lot of it tied to the middle income trap issues. The ADB is fully engaged on these, and these are just some of the documents where you've really started thinking through the challenges in UMICs. Okay, what does it take? And there's the general list drawn from many of those documents and other research. Take a quick look at it. No reason to go down through it, except to say that there are a couple of items like, for example, adequate security that you wouldn't normally see. If you think about this in terms of building or shaping an institutional and policy environment, you build it and they will come. That can miss the obvious thing that you would be thinking about is that misses the fact that what you're trying to do is get firms, domestic and foreign, to make these long-term investments, to move up into higher reaches of global supply chains. And all the things we're doing here are addressing the things that would keep them from doing that. That's why security is there. The adequate security, conflict management, organized crime, transnational crime, this is all part of that story. Enhanced resilience, we know. Most of this takes place in urban areas, pretty obvious point. This one is really important at the bottom, though, because modern states are expensive. And we'll get to something in just a second, and I'll show you why. So you've got to start generating more revenue. That's partly a matter of taking more tax and holding on to it, but getting the taxes right so that you're not killing growth, but then also countering the bleeding effect of corruption. All that has to be done. Okay, thought exercise. Sum all this up and what I call the S-curve of state institutional development. And this will tell us something, so bear with me for a second, and it'll tell us something near the end. Okay, quickly, the x-axis, GNI per capita, pretty straightforward, and there's your basic breakpoints. Over here on the y-axis it's pretty abstract. It comes out of Fukuyama and others, but the idea is total stock of state institutions, strength and effectiveness. It's impossible to actually measure that. It just covers too much. Like I said, it's thought exercise. What you would normally think, if you weren't thinking too deeply about it, is that as the national income rises, you can afford more institutions. But you also have to have more institutions, more effective, and the strength and effectiveness of those institutions, you have to have more to keep the growth going. So you'd think it was a kind of a straight line. What we do in the development business, in the development industry, development community, is we do something different. We try to front load this. It's kind of a C-curve. We invest heavily in institutions up front to drive development faster, right? Now let's look at the reality. What actually happens? It has been a long, hard slog getting from down here to this point at 4,000. The truth is, many institutions, as Danny Roderick and Fukuyama and others would say, many of those institutions don't work very well. But the truth is, you don't need a lot. You need some things to work very well, some things to work just good enough, and some things don't matter much. If it's Suharto dealing with roads in eastern Indonesia, you can build a roads ministry. Suharto can also simply put somebody in charge that's answering to him, and that person will hire his nephews and cousins and brother, and they'll do what he tells them to do, and they'll build the roads. That's not modern institutions. That's Weber's traditional governance, traditional state. Okay, so at the bottom end, doesn't take a lot. Doesn't slow growth to have weak institutions. At the top end, everything's there. If you look at these countries at 20,000 GNI per capita, pretty much everything is there. Now they don't necessarily work that well. You've got places like Greece where you've got serious problems, mostly from political intervention, but everything is basically there. Well, what that suggests is that in this phase, the AMIC phase, 4 to 20, it's actually an S-curve. Everything that we've been working on back here that didn't work very well but was important, now it has to work really well. And it's interlocking institutions, coordinated and sequenced development. Basically, you have to move up that curve, and that is really difficult, and it's very expensive. For the most part, that's also happening without external subsidized assistance. Okay. That was the story that you would all know. The S-curve may be a little different, but that's the story that you know well. Any economist, development economist knows that story well. But now I want to point to something different. The underlying challenge that you would normally say, look, we don't deal with politics. That turns out to be a big problem. Why is it so difficult for AMICs to make progress on economic upgrading? Well, the first thing is, obviously institutional reform is technically plus. We know that. The second thing is there are several ways that you can simply put it off. You can export natural resources like oil and gas, like Malaysia does. I think 40% of revenues of state budget is from natural resource exports. You can be the Philippines or Sri Lanka, heavy remittances, or you can import cheap labor. Thailand has 3 million Laotians, Cambodians, and Burmese. That puts off the day. That's driving down the cost of labor, keeping it artificially low, and puts off the day when that reckoning comes, although the reckoning is there in Thailand now. Malaysia has about 1 million to 1.5 million Indonesians at that same level. Okay. The third thing, though, is that upgrading reforms are potentially really politically risky. They're risky for politicians, and they're risky for technocrats. All major reforms, obvious point, all major reforms create winners and losers. Every advance on that list can become a political battleground, and that can slow things down. Good outcomes are outcomes that aren't technically perfect, but that are sound and that are politically possible. Getting to politically possible is politics. It's a matter of negotiating, conflict, compromise, and it's a complex business that I'm calling political management here. So skilled political management is the essential thing. It's building reform coalitions, effective use of incentives and sanctions, responding to populist mobilizations, ensuring that the benefits are reasonably shared. All that's easier said than done, though. As an additional set of problems, economic disputes, economic policy struggles, political struggles, get drawn into broader currents of political conflict in countries. And in these AMICs, if you look globally, most of those countries do not look like Malaysia or Singapore. Most of them have lots of political instabilities. They have growth slowdowns, they have political instabilities. What you want to look at as a model is Latin America and Turkey. What's happening in Thailand is not out of the norm. The way this has worked in Malaysia is kind of and China's out of the norm. Okay, it's getting harder because the diversity of fault lines complicates political management. And we know all these things. The middle class is rising, educated youth. You have center-periphery conflicts. You think about Seoul in those early days, Seoul versus Busan and Chosen and the struggles that went on there, or between Bangkok and the north and the northeast. Real or perceived inequality gets heavily politicized. That's a global movement that has happened. But it makes conflicts over inequality that much more intense. Okay, lingering ethnic, sectarian, and subnational conflicts, and then lastly, powerful entrenched elites will mobilize those various interests, and it becomes harder to politically move forward. ICT and social media vastly increase that. Poor political management can lead to stalling of reforms in AMICs, but also to increasing instability. You look at Thailand as a good example. If you know Latin America, you can see how that's working. You can see it in Turkey. It's important to take a firm level perspective. Both negatively impact the willingness of the private sector to make those costly long-term investments that are the essence of upgrading, of moving into higher productivity, innovation-driven, into an innovation-driven economy. In AMICs, periods of political instability, social unrest, and occasional violence are the norm, as I say, I put Latin America there as the obvious point. We don't normally think that, if you look at it in terms of as an economist, you look at Latin America and you look at Southeast Asia, and you'd say apples and oranges. But if you look at the politics around reform, there are similarities that are important. Okay, democracy. Does democracy help? Because remember what you're doing, does it help political management? Does it help you get to the consensus around complex reforms and then keep them going for 30, 40 years? Depends in part on formal and informal policy making institutions. But there are built-in challenges for early democratizing AMICs. If you look at the cluster of countries that made it a generation ago, and you add to that China, those look a lot like the countries from the 19th century. Japan, Germany, Italy, those late developers. They're very similar. The countries that you're seeing coming on now in Asia are democratizing at the beginning of that. They already democratized going into that curve. There are built-in problems. Overcoming resistance of powerful oligarchic factions when it's difficult to concentrate that power in a single party. Short-term constituent demands drive policy. Technocratic parties are penetrated by partisan politics. And the frequency of elections makes it very hard to have a solid, technically sound agenda and keep it going over a long period. The implications for us are that in the Asian AMIC transitions that are coming, that we're in now and that are coming, the greatest challenges will likely revolve around political management. And globally, there are very, very few examples to draw from, almost none. They're basically European. You've got Finland, Ireland, you've got Israel, so you really don't have examples elsewhere. And Latin America is a difficult one. Now, very quickly addressing these, and I see the time's gone, but let me give just quickly, what would you do? First thing, and let me make this point right up front. This seems simple. Need a greater awareness of the way, the ADB needs the greater awareness of the ways in which a country's political institutions and political dynamics affect policy outcomes. Who do you go visit when you do a mission to a country? The ministerial secretary, technocrats, think tanks, NGOs, businesses. You very rarely will go to see politicians, parties, parliament, the committees in parliament. And yet they're the ones, those are the sources of potential problem when you do policy-based lending and down the road, and you get that first tranche goes and you have an agreement on policies that are on steps that will be taken next, and then they don't happen. A lot of that is political. So engaging with the right players is important. Thinking about what the implications of a prescription are to policy, to political management. Several other points here. We just go down to the last one is a little bit different on accelerating urban development, recognizing that political management is the critical thing there as well. You're talking about elected mayors, most of these large cities now. Deeper exploration of the potential for the ADB's cooperation and integration efforts, regional cooperation and integration efforts to strengthen domestic support, to get some of those constituencies to buy into a broader agenda. Now, this last cluster had to do with the fact that these countries are early democratizers. We don't really know much about how this works in countries that have been democratic early in that step. They're not Asian, they're not Latin America, but they still manage things in a way. How did they do that? How did Finland do it? How did Ireland do it? How did Israel do it? Then you got the cases like Latin America, Turkey, where this hasn't gone as well. So how did they manage it? This next point, explore regional dialogue among AMICs, that's there because this is kind of the frontier. If you haven't got historical cases to draw from, you're really creating best practice as you go. These countries need to be talking to each other about political management. Lastly, the idea of new partnerships that would focus on political management. So just to sum up, that's a take on the whole UMIC, AMIC set of challenges that the bank has really begun to grapple, that the ADB has really begun to grapple with in good ways. This is simply a recommendation to be thinking more about the political and stability dimensions of that, and finding ways to get into it. And if you look at each of those things that I was talking about there, none of those require the bank to pick sides, to be political. All of them have to do with helping countries get to yes on critical upgrading reforms. Let me stop there.